The night air along Rodeo Drive shimmered with expensive lights and quiet arrogance. Luxury storefronts glowed like glass aquariums, each one displaying a version of success that felt untouchable, almost cruel. Eleanor Hayes walked through it all without slowing her pace. She wore a simple black coat, perfectly fitted, the kind that didn't beg for attention yet somehow commanded it. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement, steady and unhurried. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who belonged here. No hesitation, no awe, no need to prove anything. That was when she passed them. Adrian Cole stood near the entrance of a private jewelry boutique, laughing. His hand rested possessively on the waist of Serena Vale, her polished smile reflecting the diamonds behind the glass.
He looked exactly as he always had, tailored suit, confident posture, the ease of a man who believed the world still bent toward him. Eleanor walked right past. No pause, no glance, no flicker of recognition. Adrian didn't notice her, neither did Serena. And that was the moment everything shifted. 5 years ago, Eleanor would have shrunk at the sight of him. Her heart would have raced, her breath caught somewhere between anger and grief. She would have replayed old conversations, wondered what she did wrong, questioned her worth in the shadow of his success. But tonight, her pulse was calm. As she passed, a faint trace of Serena's perfume drifted through the air, sharp, expensive, familiar. Eleanor recognized it instantly. There had been a time when that scent haunted her. Tonight, it meant nothing. Behind her calm exterior, memories stirred. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to remind her of the distance she had traveled. There had been nights when she cried alone in a studio apartment that barely fit a bed and a desk. Mornings when she stared at her phone, waiting for messages that never came. Courtrooms where her name felt smaller than the signatures pressed against legal paper. Moments when she wondered if disappearing had been the only way to survive. But she hadn't disappeared. She rebuilt, slowly, quietly, painfully. Eleanor reached the corner and stopped at the crosswalk. The light turned red. She stood still, hands relaxed at her sides, gazing at the reflections of passing cars in the storefront windows. For a brief second, the glass showed her reflection, poised, composed, unrecognizable even to herself from years ago. Across the street, Adrian laughed again. Serena leaned in, whispering something into his ear, convinced she had won a prize that would last forever. Neither of them knew the truth. They didn't know the woman who had just passed them now held a position powerful enough to change the direction of their lives with a single decision. They didn't know that the discarded ex-wife they once dismissed had outgrown them in every way that mattered. Eleanor exhaled softly as the light turned green. She stepped forward, and behind her, the past remained frozen, unaware it was already losing. Before Eleanor Hayes became invisible, she was indispensable. She remembered the early years clearly, the cramped apartment with uneven floors, the constant hum of traffic outside the windows, and Adrian at the small kitchen table, sleeves rolled up, sketching ideas on a legal pad. He used to look at her then, really look at her, ask what she thought, ask if a decision felt right. Eleanor had believed that was what partnership meant. She was the one who stayed awake while he rehearsed investor pitches, the one who corrected his slides, softened his tone, reminded him when confidence crossed into arrogance. While Adrian built his reputation, Eleanor built the structure that held him steady. She tracked expenses, proofread emails, hosted dinners that impressed the right people. None of it came with a title. None of it came with credit. At first,
she didn't mind. She told herself love didn't need an audience. But success changed the temperature of their home. The kitchen table disappeared, replaced by glass surfaces that showed fingerprints too easily. Conversations became shorter. Adrian's phone never stopped lighting up. When Eleanor spoke, he listened with half an ear, already thinking 3 steps ahead.
"You wouldn't understand," he said once, not unkindly, just dismissive. That sentence lodged itself deep. Eleanor still tried. She adjusted her schedule around his, learned to eat dinner alone without complaint. She attended events in dresses chosen to blend in, not stand out, because Adrian preferred it that way. She learned which opinions to keep to herself and which smiles to practice in public. When Serena entered the picture, Eleanor didn't know her name at first. She only noticed the shift. Adrian came home later, laughed more at his phone than at her, started calling Eleanor emotional whenever she asked questions. "You're imagining things," he said. "You're overthinking." Gaslighting was subtle. It wore the disguise of reason. The night Eleanor finally saw the truth wasn't dramatic. No screaming, no confrontation. Just a restaurant reflection in a darkened window. Adrian leaning toward another woman, his face open in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in years. Serena's hand rested on his wrist, familiar and confident. Eleanor went home and waited. When Adrian walked in, he didn't deny it. He sighed, as if she had inconvenienced him by noticing. He talked about growth, about phases, about how people outgrew each other. He never apologized. The divorce moved fast. His lawyers were efficient. The settlement left Eleanor with enough to survive, not enough to recover. Adrian framed it as generosity. The papers were thick. The language was sharp. Eleanor signed because she was exhausted, because fighting required a strength she hadn't yet rebuilt. The day she moved out, she packed only what fit in 2 suitcases. Adrian wasn't there. He sent a text instead. "Wishing you the best." Eleanor stood alone in the empty apartment, keys in her palm, realizing something far more painful than betrayal. She had vanished long before she ever left, and no one had noticed. Eleanor didn't discover the affair the way movies liked to show it. There was no lipstick on a collar, no dramatic phone call in the middle of the night. What cut deepest arrived quietly, disguised as coincidence. It started with a calendar notification that wasn't hers. She had opened Adrian's MacBook one afternoon, not to snoop, but to print a document he needed for a meeting. His laptop sat open on the dining table, the screen glowing softly in the late light. A reminder popped up in the corner. Dinner, 8 p.m. Serena. No last name. Just one word, as if it needed no explanation. Eleanor stared at it longer than she should have. She told herself it was business, networking, something harmless. That was the habit she had learned over years, translate discomfort into patience, doubt into trust. Still, her hands felt cold as she closed the laptop. That night, Adrian came home late, later than usual. His jacket smelled unfamiliar, not perfume exactly, but something sweet and deliberate. Eleanor noticed the detail instantly. She always noticed details. That had once been her strength. "Long day," he said, loosening his tie without looking at her. She nodded. "Did dinner run late?" Adrian paused for half a second, just long enough. "Yeah, clients," he said, already walking away. That pause was the knife. Over the next weeks, the pattern sharpened. New passwords, phone turned face down. Meetings that didn't align with the calendar she still kept out of habit. Adrian grew impatient when Eleanor asked simple questions. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone did the damage. "You're being insecure," he told her one night. This is why I don't like explaining things. Insecure. The word landed like a verdict. The truth finally revealed itself on a rain-soaked evening in Manhattan. Eleanor had left work early, a headache pressing behind her eyes. She decided to walk instead of taking the subway, letting the cold air clear her thoughts. That was when she saw them, across the street, through the window of a dimly lit restaurant. Adrian leaned forward, his expression unguarded. Serena sat across from him, her hand resting lightly on his wrist, familiar and unafraid. Eleanor recognized that look on his face. It was the one he used to save for her, the one that said, "You're safe here." She didn't go inside. She didn't confront him. She stood there as rain soaked through her coat, watching her marriage collapse without sound. In that moment, something inside her shut down, not with anger, but with clarity. When Adrian came home later, Eleanor was waiting. "I saw you," she said calmly. He exhaled, irritated more than ashamed. He didn't deny it. He talked about pressure, about change, about how relationships evolved and how he felt constrained. Serena, he said, understood him. Serena didn't ask questions. That hurt more than the affair. Eleanor realized then that betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about choosing someone else's comfort over her humanity. She went to bed alone that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing something irreversible had happened. Love hadn't been stolen from her. It had been quietly handed away. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne, a place where endings were processed efficiently and without sympathy. Eleanor sat at the small table beside her attorney, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening as her marriage was reduced to dates, assets, and clauses. Across the room, Adrian looked untouched by the gravity of it all. He sat upright in a tailored suit, calm, confident, exchanging quiet remarks with his legal team as if this were just another business meeting. Serena wasn't there, of course. She didn't need to be. Her absence was a statement in itself. She was already waiting for him on the other side of this formality. Eleanor felt the imbalance immediately. Adrian's lawyers spoke quickly, fluently, with the assurance of people who had done this many times before. They framed the settlement as fair, generous even. They emphasized how Adrian was ensuring Eleanor's comfort, as though comfort were a measurable commodity. Eleanor listened, stunned by how easily her years were dismissed. Her attorney leaned in and whispered explanations, pointing to paragraphs dense with language designed to confuse. Eleanor nodded, though her thoughts lagged behind. She was exhausted, not just from the proceedings, but from months of emotional erosion that had left her without the strength to argue every point. When the judge asked if she understood the terms, Eleanor said yes. She understood that she was walking away with a fraction of what she had helped build. She understood that fighting would mean years of legal warfare against resources she didn't have. She understood that dignity sometimes meant knowing when the cost of resistance was too high. Adrian finally looked at her when the papers were slid across the table. For a brief second, Eleanor hoped, irrationally, that he might hesitate, that he might remember the nights she stayed up editing his proposals, the quiet sacrifices that never made it onto a balance sheet. But his expression didn't change. "This is for the best," he said softly, not unkindly. "We'll both move on." Move on. As if she were a chapter he had finished reading. Eleanor picked up the pen. Her hand trembled just slightly before steadying. She signed her name where indicated, each letter feeling heavier than the last. The finality of it settled in her chest, like a weight she couldn't yet lift. The judge declared the divorce finalized. Just like that, it was over.
Outside the courthouse, Eleanor stood alone on the steps, the city moving around her without pause. Adrian walked past her without stopping, already on his phone, his voice light as he spoke to someone she didn't need to see to recognize. A car waited for him at the curb. No one waited for her. Eleanor took a breath and turned in the opposite direction. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. She walked until the courthouse disappeared behind her, until the noise softened and the truth became impossible to ignore. She hadn't just lost a husband. She'd been erased from a story she helped write. And now, she had to figure out how to exist again, without permission, without protection, and without anyone expecting her to survive. Eleanor's new apartment was so small it felt temporary, as if the universe itself didn't believe she would stay. One narrow window faced a brick wall. The radiator hissed at night like it was complaining on her behalf. The silence inside that space was louder than any argument she and Adrian had ever had. The first week passed in fragments. She woke up without an alarm because there was nowhere she urgently needed to be.
She drank coffee standing up because the table wobbled. She checked her phone out of habit, then remembered no one was waiting on the other side of the screen. The routines of marriage lingered like muscle memory, painful and automatic. At night, the collapse came faster. Eleanor lay on a mattress that creaked whenever she shifted her weight, staring at the ceiling as memories replayed without mercy. Adrian's voice, his laugh, the way he once reached for her hand in crowded rooms. Her mind searched desperately for a moment she could point to and say, "That's when it broke." But there wasn't one. It had eroded slowly, quietly, until she was standing in the aftermath, wondering how she hadn't seen it sooner. Money anxiety set in like a fever. Bills arrived with precise timing, each envelope a reminder that survival now depended entirely on her.
She calculated and recalculated, cutting expenses down to the bare minimum. Groceries became math problems. Small indulgences felt reckless. Even rest came with guilt attached. Some days she didn't leave the apartment. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, wrapped in an old sweater, listening to the city live a life that no longer included her. Outside, people hurried to places that mattered to them. Inside, time stretched endlessly, shapeless and heavy. The worst moments came without warning. A commercial about vacation homes, a couple laughing on the subway, a man adjusting his cufflinks in a reflection that reminded her too much of Adrian. Each one landed like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Eleanor learned to breathe through it, to let the pain crest and pass without collapsing completely. But there were nights when she came close.
One evening, after a rejection email from a job she was overqualified for and under-networked to land, Eleanor slid down the wall and cried until her throat burned. Not loud sobs, quiet, shaking breaths that felt like her body was trying to expel something toxic. She wondered if disappearing had been a mistake, if fighting harder would have saved her. If she had failed some invisible test of resilience that everyone else seemed to pass effortlessly. The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers. What kept her going wasn't hope. It was something smaller. Stubbornness. Eleanor refused to let the worst moment of her life become the last defining one. Even when she couldn't see a way forward, she stayed. She got up. She sent applications. She showed up to interviews with a calm voice and trembling hands. This wasn't a comeback yet. This was survival. And survival, she would learn, was the first quiet victory no one applauded, but everything depended on. Eleanor thought she had already learned the full shape of betrayal. She was wrong. In the weeks after the divorce, there was one person she still trusted without hesitation:
Maya Reynolds, her closest friend for nearly a decade. Maya had been there before the marriage, during it, and after its collapse. She had held Eleanor's hand in hospital waiting rooms, laughed with her over cheap wine, sworn loyalty in moments that felt unbreakable. Or so Eleanor believed. Maya was the one who insisted Eleanor get out of the apartment sometimes. Coffee, she said, fresh air, normal conversation. She framed it as care, and Eleanor, fragile and exhausted, accepted it gratefully. Those afternoons became Eleanor's only sense of connection, the one reminder that she wasn't completely alone. What Eleanor didn't know was that Maya was still talking to Adrian. It started innocently, at least on the surface. A text here, a call there. Adrian checking in, asking how Eleanor was doing, presenting himself as concerned and mature. Maya told herself it was harmless. She told herself she was helping, keeping the peace, staying neutral. Neutrality, Eleanor would later learn, is just betrayal with better excuses. The truth surfaced accidentally. One evening, Maya left her phone on the table while she went to the bathroom. Eleanor wasn't snooping. She wasn't suspicious. The screen lit up with a message preview, bright and unavoidable. Serena wants to know if Eleanor is still struggling financially. Eleanor stared at the words, her breath catching painfully in her chest. Her hands trembled as she picked up the phone. The message thread unraveled everything. Screenshots, updates, casual remarks about Eleanor's job search, her apartment, her emotional state. Information passed along like gossip, packaged neatly for Serena's curiosity and Adrian's reassurance. They weren't worried about Eleanor. They were tracking her. When Maya returned, Eleanor was still standing there, phone in hand. There was a moment, just one, where Maya could have lied her way out. But the silence said more than any confession. Her face drained of color, guilt flashing across her features before she tried to mask it. "I didn't think it mattered," Maya said quickly. "I was just talking." They asked questions. Questions. As if Eleanor's pain were a public update. Eleanor felt something crack that she hadn't even known was still intact. This betrayal didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with devastation so quiet, it almost felt numb. Losing Adrian had hurt, but losing Maya stripped away the last illusion of safety. "You watched me fall," Eleanor said softly, "and reported it." Maya cried, apologized, explained. None of it mattered. Trust, Eleanor realized, isn't destroyed by cruelty alone. It's destroyed by carelessness. That night, Eleanor walked home alone, the city colder than before. The loss of that friendship hurt differently than the marriage. There was no legal paperwork, no closure, just absence where support had once lived. For the first time, Eleanor understood something terrifying and necessary. She was truly on her own. And if she was going to survive, she couldn't afford to lean on anyone who saw her pain as currency. That realization didn't make her stronger yet, but it made her awake. And awakening, she would soon learn, was the beginning of everything. There was a night Eleanor came closer to disappearing than she ever would again. It wasn't dramatic. No rain pouring from the sky, no loud breakdown that would have warned someone to step in. It was quiet, ordinary, and that made it more dangerous. She had come home from another long day of unanswered applications and polite rejections, her body aching in a way that sleep never seemed to fix. The apartment felt smaller than usual. The single lamp cast a weak circle of light on the floor, leaving the corners in shadow. Eleanor dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and stood there without moving. The silence pressed against her chest until breathing felt like work. For the first time since everything fell apart, she didn't feel sad. She felt empty. She opened her laptop and stared at the screen, not really seeing the words.
The numbers in her bank account blinked back at her, indifferent and exact. Enough to survive another month, maybe 2 if nothing went wrong. But life always went wrong eventually. Her phone buzzed. For half a second, hope flared. Then it died just as quickly. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't an apology. It was a message from an unknown number. Just checking in. Thought you should know people are talking. No name, no explanation. Eleanor didn't reply. She set the phone down slowly, her hands shaking. Talking meant watching. Watching meant judging. She imagined Adrian's world, polished, loud, confident, speaking her name like a cautionary tale. The ex-wife who couldn't keep up. The woman who vanished. That was when the thought arrived. Not a plan, not a decision, just a question. What if I stop trying? The idea scared her with how gentle it felt. No more applications. No more explaining herself. No more waking up every morning to prove she deserved space in a world that seemed determined to erase her. She sank down onto the floor, back against the couch, knees pulled to her chest. Her breathing grew shallow. She stayed there longer than she should have, letting the darkness settle. The city outside kept moving, unaware that someone inside one of its countless apartments was quietly unraveling. Then the doorbell rang. The sound startled her so badly she flinched. No one ever came here unannounced. Her first instinct was to ignore it, pretend she wasn't home, pretend she didn't exist. The bell rang again. Reluctantly, Eleanor stood and opened the door. Grace Mitchell stood in the hallway, coat still on, eyes sharp with concern. She took one look at Eleanor's face and didn't ask permission. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You weren't answering your phone," Grace said calmly. "So I came." Eleanor didn't speak. She couldn't. Grace set her bag down and turned to face her, voice steady but gentle. "Sit down." Something in that tone, firm, grounded, real, cut through the fog. Eleanor sank onto the couch, the weight she'd been carrying finally visible to someone else. Her composure shattered in silence, tears spilling without sound. Grace sat beside her, not touching her, just present. "You're not done," Grace said quietly. "You're just exhausted." Those words didn't fix everything, but they kept Eleanor alive long enough for the next chapter to begin. Healing did not arrive like a revelation. There was no morning when Eleanor woke up feeling whole again, no sudden surge of motivation that erased the months of pain. What came instead was routine, quiet, unglamorous, and stubbornly slow. Grace insisted on it. Structure, she said, was not control. It was protection. Eleanor started with small rules. Wake up at the same time every day. Eat something even when food tasted like obligation. Leave the apartment, even if only to walk 1 block and back. She learned to stop waiting for inspiration and act without it. Some days, that was the only victory she managed. Therapy became a fixed point in her week. The room was neutral, deliberately plain, designed not to distract from the work. Eleanor spoke haltingly at first, her words carefully measured, as if revealing too much might collapse her again. But week by week, the truth surfaced, not just about Adrian or Maya or Serena, but about herself. She talked about shrinking, about learning to be quiet so someone else could be loud, about confusing endurance with love. Naming those patterns hurt more than reliving the betrayal. It meant admitting how long she had accepted less than she deserved. Outside therapy,
Eleanor rebuilt her mind the way one might rebuild a damaged muscle. Slow repetitions, deliberate effort. She read on park benches and at the small desk by her window. Books she had once skimmed, now demanding full attention. Ideas about agency, boundaries, power that didn't rely on permission. Some pages made her angry. Others made her cry. All of them made her think. She began freelancing again, quietly, without expectations. Small projects, short deadlines, no promises of long-term security. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it reminded her that her mind still functioned, that her skills hadn't vanished with her marriage. There were setbacks, mornings when the weight returned without warning, nights when sleep refused to come, her thoughts circling the same old doubts. Healing wasn't linear. Grace warned her about that. Progress would look messy. It would feel like going backward sometimes. Eleanor learned not to panic when that happened. Instead, she paused, breathed, waited for the moment to pass. Gradually, something subtle changed. She stopped checking Adrian's name online. Stopped wondering what Serena was doing, whether their lives looked better without her. The questions lost urgency, then relevance. Eleanor's world narrowed at first, but within that smaller space, something steadier formed. A sense of self not defined by loss. One afternoon, while reviewing a project proposal, Eleanor realized she hadn't thought about her divorce in hours. The realization startled her, not because she felt cured, but because the pain no longer demanded constant attention. It existed, yes, but it no longer controlled the room. That was when Eleanor understood the truth Grace had been trying to teach her. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning how to live without bleeding every time you remembered. And for the first time since everything fell apart, Eleanor felt something close to trust. Not in other people yet, but in herself. That would be enough to carry her forward. Eleanor didn't notice the moment her life began to change. That was the strange part. There was no announcement, no dramatic turning point that signaled a new chapter. It started like everything else had lately, quietly, almost cautiously, as if the world didn't want to scare her away. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. She almost ignored it. The subject line was brief and unassuming. Introduction, Project Review. Eleanor assumed it was another short-term contract inquiry, the kind she had learned not to romanticize. Still, she opened it, scanned the details, and paused. The sender was Jonathan Pierce, a name she recognized instantly, though she couldn't immediately place why. They had met once, briefly, years ago. It came back to her slowly. A charity event Adrian had insisted on attending. Eleanor had handled the logistics that night, while Adrian networked aggressively. Jonathan had been there too, quiet, observant, not chasing attention. When a last-minute issue threatened to derail the event, Eleanor stepped in, solved it calmly, and disappeared back into the background. Jonathan had noticed. Now, he was asking for her opinion on a proposal. Not a favor, not sympathy. Her professional judgment. Eleanor hesitated before replying. Old instincts whispered caution. Don't assume this means anything. Don't get attached to potential. She responded concisely, clearly, with the same careful honesty she brought to all her work now. Jonathan replied within the hour, then again the next day. Their communication stayed professional, focused, respectful. No personal questions, no implied expectations, just work, real work, that required Eleanor to think, analyze, and speak with authority. Each exchange reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. She was good at this. A week later, Jonathan asked if she'd be willing to meet in person. Coffee, he suggested. No pressure. Eleanor agreed. They met in a quiet cafe downtown, sunlight cutting through tall windows. Jonathan was exactly as she remembered, measured, attentive, uninterested in posturing. He listened more than he spoke. When Eleanor shared her thoughts, he didn't interrupt or redirect. He asked questions that sharpened the conversation instead of controlling it. At the end of the meeting, he said something unexpected. "I've worked with a lot of smart people," Jonathan said. "Not many who think the way you do." There was no flattery in his tone, just fact. Eleanor felt the weight of that sentence later, walking home. Not because it promised anything immediate, but because it acknowledged something real, something earned. Opportunities followed, small at first, consulting work, strategy sessions, introductions to people who didn't care about her past, only her insight. Eleanor didn't rush. She evaluated every step carefully, aware of how fragile momentum could be. Jonathan never pushed. He didn't frame himself as a savior. He didn't speak of redemption arcs or second chances. He treated Eleanor like a peer from the start, and that mattered more than grand gestures ever could. One evening, as Eleanor closed her laptop after a long session of focused work, she realized she felt tired, but not depleted. The difference startled her. This wasn't luck. This wasn't rescue. This was alignment. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she might actually shape. Adrian Cole believed he was winning. From the outside, everything supported that belief. His name appeared in business features. His calendar stayed full. The apartment he shared with Serena overlooked the city like a trophy case made of glass and steel. When people congratulated him on the divorce, he accepted it with a practiced smile, as if shedding Eleanor had been a necessary upgrade. What Adrian didn't notice at first were the fractures forming beneath the polish. They began small. Meetings that ended without commitments. Investors who nodded politely but delayed decisions. Partners who once returned calls immediately now asked assistants to circle back next quarter. Adrian blamed market volatility. Everyone did. It was an easy explanation, one that required no self-examination. Serena, however, noticed everything. She paid attention to the way Adrian grew sharper at home, more irritable when outcomes didn't align with his expectations. She adjusted her behavior accordingly, more compliments, more reassurance, fewer questions. Serena understood leverage. She knew when to soothe and when to stay silent. But ambition has a way of overplaying its hand. Serena began inserting herself into conversations she didn't fully understand, pushing ideas that sounded impressive but lacked substance. Adrian let it happen. He liked how she mirrored his confidence, how she echoed his language of growth and dominance. It felt good to be admired without resistance. The first real crack came during a board meeting. Adrian presented an aggressive expansion plan, one Serena had helped him refine late the night before. He spoke with conviction, expecting the usual momentum. Instead, the room cooled. Questions came, pointed ones, about risk exposure, about timing, about assumptions that no longer held. For the first time in a long while, Adrian didn't have clean answers. He left the meeting frustrated, telling himself the board was being overly cautious. But the doubt lingered. It followed him home, into conversations with Serena that ended in subtle tension. She pushed him to move faster, to assert control. Adrian pushed back, sensing, without fully understanding, that something was off. The second crack was quieter, but deeper. A long-term partner withdrew from a joint venture with little explanation. A legal advisor flagged concerns Adrian hadn't anticipated. The safety net he'd relied on for years suddenly felt thinner, less forgiving. Decisions he once made instinctively now required effort. Adrian found himself thinking about Eleanor at unexpected moments. Not with regret, at least not consciously, but with comparison. She would have asked the questions the board asked. She would have slowed him down at exactly the points where Serena urged speed. The thought irritated him. He dismissed it quickly, annoyed at himself for even going there. Serena sensed the shift. She became sharper, less patient. The admiration that once felt effortless now carried expectation. She wanted results, visibility, reassurance that aligning with Adrian was still the right move. When he hesitated, she noticed. When he faltered, she filed it away. Adrian told himself this was normal.
Pressure came with growth. Every empire faced turbulence. What he didn't see, what he couldn't afford to see, was that the foundation he'd built his success on had changed the moment Eleanor left. She hadn't been decoration. She had been balance. And now, without it, every crack echoed louder, each one a warning Adrian wasn't ready to hear. The invitation arrived without drama, which somehow made it more dangerous. Eleanor found it late one evening, buried between invoices and routine emails. At first glance, it looked like just another formal notice, clean typography, neutral language, no unnecessary flourish. She almost archived it without opening the attachment. Habit had taught her not to expect anything extraordinary. Then she read the location. The Plaza Hotel. Her hand stilled on the trackpad. For a moment, her chest tightened in a way she hadn't felt in months. Not panic, recognition. The plaza wasn't just a venue. It was memory layered on marble and gold. Charity galas she had attended on Adrian's arm, conversations she had navigated carefully, rooms where she had learned to disappear politely. This time, the invitation wasn't addressed to Mrs. Adrian Cole. It was addressed to Eleanor Hayes. The event was a private investment gala, invitation only, hosted by a consortium of firms she'd recently consulted for. Her role was listed clearly: strategic advisor, not guest, not +1, advisor. Eleanor read the details twice, then closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. The apartment was quiet, the city humming distantly through the window. She let the moment settle without rushing to define it. This wasn't coincidence. Jonathan had mentioned the event casually the week before, framed it as a networking opportunity, nothing more. He hadn't emphasized its scale, or who else would be there.
Eleanor understood now why. Pressure distorted things. He hadn't wanted to load meaning onto it prematurely. She opened the email again and scrolled. The guest list was not included, but she didn't need to see it to know. Adrian moved in these circles. Serena would be there too. The realization arrived calmly, without the spike of fear she once expected. Eleanor noted it the way one notes weather, something to prepare for, not something to dread. Still, the decision weighed on her. Attending meant stepping back into a world that had once rejected her. It meant risking the careful equilibrium she'd built. Healing had given her distance, not immunity. She wondered if she was ready. Grace noticed the shift immediately when Eleanor mentioned the invitation the next day. "You don't have to go," Grace said.
Readiness isn't about proving anything.
Eleanor nodded. She knew that was true. But as the day went on, another truth surfaced just as clearly. Avoiding the room wouldn't protect her anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been erased in silence. She wasn't the one who signed papers just to escape the pain. She had earned her place, slowly and without shortcuts. This invitation wasn't a trap. It was a test of whether she still believed she belonged. That night, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. She didn't imagine revenge. She didn't rehearse speeches. She thought about posture, presence, breathing. She accepted the invitation, not to confront the past, but to walk into a future that no longer needed permission from it. And somewhere across the city, without knowing why, Adrian's certainty shifted just slightly, as if something he couldn't see had begun moving toward him. The Plaza Hotel glowed like it always had, soft gold lights spilling onto the street, doormen standing with practiced stillness, the kind of elegance that never needed to announce itself. Eleanor stepped out of the car and paused for half a breath, letting the weight of the night settle on her shoulders. Inside, the air hummed with restrained energy. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across polished marble floors. Conversations overlapped in low, confident tones. Glasses clinked gently, never loudly. This was a room where power preferred subtlety, where influence didn't raise its voice. Eleanor felt it immediately, and to her own surprise, she didn't shrink. She moved through the space with calm precision, acknowledging greetings, exchanging handshakes, listening more than she spoke. Her presence was different now, grounded, unrushed. She didn't scan the room for threats or ghosts. She focused on the moment in front of her, the work she was here to do. Still, silence has a way of sharpening awareness. Across the room, Adrian arrived. He entered with Serena at his side, her hand looped through his arm, her smile polished to perfection. Heads turned. A few people nodded in recognition. Adrian wore confidence well. It fit him like an old, tailored jacket. He laughed easily, soaking in attention he still believed was his birthright. Serena leaned close, whispering something that made him smile wider. Eleanor noticed them without reacting. She didn't look away quickly. She didn't stare. She simply registered their presence the way one registers furniture in a familiar room. For a fleeting second, memory flickered. The echo of standing beside him at events like this, adjusting her posture to complement his, timing her words so he could shine. That version of herself felt distant now. Adrian hadn't seen her yet. She knew that instinctively. If he had, there would have been a shift, something loud, something obvious. Instead, the room continued on its smooth trajectory, unaware that its balance was about to change. Eleanor took a glass of champagne from a passing server and held it loosely, not drinking. She listened as two investors discussed a potential merger, offered a concise observation when invited, and watched interest spark in their eyes. Respect, she had learned, was quiet when it was real. Across the room, Serena laughed too loudly. Eleanor felt the contrast without judgment. She understood now that performance required effort. Presence did not. Minutes passed, then more. Adrian finally turned, scanning the room absently. His expression relaxed until his gaze landed on Eleanor. The shift was immediate. His smile faltered just slightly. Confusion crossed his face, followed by a tightening around his eyes. He looked again, as if his mind were correcting an error. Serena followed his line of sight, her grip on his arm tightening when she saw Eleanor. For a brief, suspended moment, no one moved. The room didn't know it yet, but something fundamental had changed. Not with noise, not with confrontation, just with recognition. Eleanor met Adrian's gaze calmly. No challenge, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Then she turned back to her conversation, unbothered, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all.
And in that silence, thick, charged, unmistakable, Adrian understood something he wasn't ready to face. She wasn't here for him. and that terrified him more than any confrontation ever could. Adrian couldn't stop looking at her. He told himself it was coincidence at first, a resemblance, a trick of light shaped by memory and expectation. Manhattan was full of women who dressed well, carried themselves with purpose, moved through rooms like they owned the air around them. Still, something about her posture refused to be dismissed. That calm, that quiet authority. It unsettled him. He shifted his stance, angling his body to get a clearer view. Serena felt the movement immediately. She followed his gaze, her expression tightening as recognition dawned, not confusion, but calculation. She knew who Eleanor was the moment she saw her. She had seen the photos, heard the stories framed conveniently in Adrian's favor. The discarded wife, the woman who faded. This woman had not faded. "She looks familiar," Adrian murmured, more to himself than to Serena. Serena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Probably someone from finance," she said lightly. "This place is full of them." Adrian nodded, but the unease didn't fade. He watched as Eleanor spoke with a small group near the far side of the room. She wasn't performing. She wasn't posturing. She listened, then spoke briefly, her words landing with precision. Heads leaned in, interest sparked, respect followed. That wasn't coincidence. Memory rushed in uninvited. Eleanor at their old kitchen table, pointing out flaws in his projections. Eleanor asking questions he hadn't wanted to hear. Eleanor staying calm when he grew impatient. He had called it caution, insecurity. He had told himself she lacked vision. Standing here now, Adrian wondered, too late, if he had misnamed wisdom. Serena tightened her grip on his arm. "Do you want a drink?" she asked. The question carried an edge. Adrian shook his head absently. His focus was fixed. Then Eleanor turned. Their eyes met fully this time. There was no shock on her face, no flicker of surprise, just recognition, clean and unburdened. She didn't stiffen. She didn't soften. She held his gaze the way one acknowledges an old acquaintance encountered unexpectedly in a new city. Adrian felt heat rise to his chest. For a split second, he expected something from her. Anger, satisfaction, even pain. Anything that would confirm the narrative he'd built, that she was damaged by him, defined by loss. But Eleanor offered nothing. She gave a polite nod, a courtesy. Then she turned back to her conversation. The dismissal hit harder than any confrontation. Serena's composure cracked first. "Why is she here?" she asked sharply. "Who invited her?" Adrian didn't answer. He didn't know, and that frightened him. He scanned the room, noticing subtle shifts he'd missed earlier. The way certain people gravitated toward Eleanor. The way Jonathan Pierce stood near her, not possessive, but aligned. The way introductions flowed naturally, as if she had always belonged. Adrian felt suddenly exposed, like someone who had shown up to a formal event in yesterday's clothes. He realized then that this wasn't a coincidence. Eleanor hadn't wandered into his world by accident. She had built her own. And for the first time since the divorce, Adrian understood something with brutal clarity. She hadn't lost. She had escaped. And whatever was about to happen next, he was no longer in control of the story. The announcement came without ceremony. A subtle shift in lighting, a quiet chime through the room. Conversations softened, then stilled, as attention turned toward the stage near the center of the ballroom. Eleanor felt it before she heard it, the collective pause, the instinctive awareness that something important was about to be said. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward first. He didn't command the room with volume. He never had to. His presence carried weight,
because it didn't ask for permission. He thanked the hosts, acknowledged the firms involved, and spoke briefly about the purpose of the evening: long-term strategy, sustainable growth, partnerships built on discipline rather than spectacle. Then he paused.
And finally, Jonathan said, his voice calm, measured, "I'd like to introduce the strategic advisor who helped shape the framework behind our newest initiative." Eleanor felt the stillness tighten. Jonathan turned slightly and extended his hand toward her. "Please welcome Eleanor Hayes." For half a second, the room didn't react. Then heads turned. Whispers rippled outward, soft but unmistakable. Eleanor stepped forward with steady composure, her heels quiet against the marble as she moved into the light. She didn't rush. She didn't smile to disarm. She simply arrived. Adrian felt the floor tilt beneath him. The title echoed louder than the applause that followed. Strategic advisor. Not assistant, not consultant. Advisor. His mind scrambled to recalibrate, searching for a version of reality where this made sense. There wasn't one. Eleanor took her place beside Jonathan, accepting the microphone without hesitation. She didn't acknowledge Adrian. She didn't scan the room for reactions. Her focus was forward, present, precise. "Thank you," she began, her voice even, unshaken. This initiative was built on one principle: that long-term success requires restraint as much as ambition. The words landed cleanly. She spoke about risk, about alignment, about the cost of growth pursued without balance. Each point was grounded, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. The room leaned in, not because she was dramatic, but because she was exact. Adrian listened, frozen. He recognized the logic, the structure. The questions she raised mirrored the ones his board had started asking him weeks ago. He felt a sharp, sinking realization. Eleanor wasn't repeating someone else's ideas. These were hers. Serena's composure shattered quietly. Her smile stiffened, eyes darting as if searching for an exit or an explanation that didn't exist. She whispered something to Adrian, but he didn't hear it. All sound narrowed to Eleanor's voice. When Eleanor finished, the applause was stronger this time, genuine, sustained. Jonathan thanked her and continued with the program, but the shift was irreversible. The room had reorganized itself around a new axis. Conversations recalibrated, interest moved. Eleanor stepped away from the stage and was immediately greeted by several attendees. Handshakes, introductions, respect offered without question. Adrian stood rooted in place, a spectator in a world he thought he owned. In that moment, he understood the full extent of his mistake. He hadn't just underestimated Eleanor. He had erased the one person who could have kept his empire from unraveling. And as the applause faded into the hum of conversation, Adrian realized the truth too late. This wasn't her comeback. It was her arrival. The room didn't erupt. It shifted. That was how the truth began to surface. Not with shouting or scandal, but with subtle gravity, pulling attention in a new direction. Eleanor stood near a marble column, listening as one conversation blended into another, her expression calm, her posture relaxed. She didn't need to move the pieces. They were already moving on their own. It started with a question. A senior partner from a private equity firm leaned towards Serena, voice polite but cool. "You mentioned earlier that you helped shape Adrian's expansion model," he said. "Which metrics did you focus on for downside protection?" Serena smiled too quickly. "Oh, you know," she said lightly. "Market momentum, brand visibility, growth narrative." The man nodded once. "I see. And the hedging structure?" Serena hesitated. Just a beat too long. Nearby, another conversation stalled. Someone asked about compliance oversight,
Someone else mentioned discrepancies flagged during due diligence. The air grew denser, curiosity sharpening into scrutiny. Serena felt it and tried to redirect, laughing softly, brushing it off as technical detail. Adrian watched, uneasy. He had always assumed Serena knew what she was doing. She sounded confident. She spoke the language. That had been enough, until now. Under direct questioning, the polish began to crack. Answers circled without landing. Assurances replaced substance. Eleanor didn't intervene. She didn't have to. Jonathan joined the cluster naturally, his presence steady. "We actually reviewed those assumptions last quarter," he said conversationally.
The projections lacked sufficient buffers. That's why we restructured the model. He gestured subtly toward Eleanor. She identified the gaps. The implication landed like a dropped glass. Eyes shifted. A few people connected dots they hadn't known were there. Someone pulled out a phone, discreetly checking notes. Another nodded slowly, understanding dawning with quiet certainty. Serena's smile faltered. Adrian felt heat rise to his face. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't know what to say that would help. The room had already made its assessment. It wasn't personal. It was professional. That was what made it devastating. A compliance officer approached Jonathan with a measured tone, referencing prior communications, emails Serena had sent, decisions she had influenced. The timeline didn't hold. The authority she claimed wasn't supported by record. The confidence she wore so easily now looked like overreach. Serena sensed the shift and tried to recover, leaning into Adrian. "We should go," she whispered. "This isn't worth it." But Adrian didn't move. He watched as a narrative he had believed, carefully, willingly, collapsed under the weight of verification. Serena hadn't been a strategic asset. She had been a mirror, reflecting his own impatience back at him. Eleanor caught his eye across the room. There was no triumph there, no judgment, only clarity. Serena pulled away, frustration flashing through her composure. "You let this happen," she hissed under her breath. Adrian didn't respond. He couldn't. Because the truth was undeniable now, visible to everyone who mattered. Eleanor hadn't returned to humiliate them. She had returned with facts, and facts, once exposed, didn't need revenge to be devastating. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It began after the gala, in the quiet days that followed, when the noise of champagne and applause faded and reality settled in. Adrian woke up the next morning with a familiar knot in his chest, the kind that used to signal pressure before a big deal. This time, it didn't go away. Emails arrived early, not congratulations, questions. A senior partner requested clarification on projections. A legal consultant flagged concerns that required immediate review. An investor postponed a meeting indefinitely. Each message was polite, professional, and unmistakably cautious. The tone was different now, reserved, distant. Adrian told himself it was temporary. He went into the office, pacing his glass-walled space, replaying the gala in his mind. Eleanor on that stage, calm, certain, untouchable. The image irritated him more than Serena's silence, more than the lingering looks from people who once deferred to him without hesitation. Serena didn't come in that day. She texted instead. Something vague about needing space, about stress, about not wanting to be the center of unfair assumptions. Adrian read the message twice before setting his phone down. For the first time, he noticed how often her support had required reassurance, how quickly admiration turned conditional. At noon, his board convened an emergency call. The questions were sharper this time, direct, uncomfortable. They referenced specific recommendations Serena had influenced,
risks that now looked reckless in hindsight. Adrian tried to defend the decisions, but his voice lacked conviction. Every justification sounded thinner, spoken aloud. When the call ended, the room felt too large. He stared out at the city, its skyline unchanged, indifferent to his unraveling. This view had once made him feel invincible. Now it only emphasized how exposed he was. The real blow came 2 days later. A long-standing partner withdrew from a major joint venture, citing strategic misalignment. Adrian understood the language well enough to hear the truth beneath it. Trust had eroded. Confidence had shifted. Toward Eleanor. Serena called that evening, her voice tight. "I think it's best if we take a step back," she said. "This isn't what I signed up for." Adrian laughed softly, the sound hollow even to his own ears. "You mean when it's not easy?" She didn't deny it. After the call ended, Adrian sat alone in the apartment they shared, the silence pressing in. For the first time, he allowed the thought he'd been avoiding to surface fully. Eleanor hadn't been holding him back. She had been anchoring him. He thought of all the times she'd questioned his instincts, slowed his momentum, forced him to justify choices instead of chasing validation. He had mistaken resistance for weakness. In truth, it had been discipline. Now, without it, everything felt unsteady. Adrian didn't lose everything overnight, but the certainty was gone, the ease, the assumption that success would continue simply because it always had. What remained was effort without clarity, ambition without balance, and worst of all, the knowledge that the woman he dismissed as replaceable had walked away with the one thing he could no longer reclaim: control. Adrian waited longer than he should have before reaching out. Pride kept him silent at first. Then fear did. By the time he finally sent the message, it was short, stripped of its usual confidence. "Can we talk? Just once." Eleanor saw it while reviewing notes late in the evening. The name on the screen didn't trigger panic or anger. It landed with a quiet finality, like a door she had already closed being tapped on one last time. She didn't reply immediately. When she did, it was simple. Tomorrow, 1 hour. They met in a quiet cafe near the river, a neutral place with no history attached to it. Eleanor arrived first and chose a table by the window. She didn't rehearse what she would say. She didn't need to. Whatever remained between them had already been lived. Adrian walked in 10 minutes later. He looked different, not disheveled, not broken, but diminished. The sharp certainty that once framed his movements had softened into hesitation. He scanned the room, spotted Eleanor, and paused before approaching, as if unsure he was welcome. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. She nodded once. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the cafe filling the space neither of them rushed to claim. Adrian cleared his throat. "I didn't expect things to turn out this way," he said finally. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I know." He let out a breath, rubbing his hands together. "I thought I understood what I was doing. I thought I was choosing growth." "And you were," Eleanor said calmly. "Just not the kind that lasts." The honesty startled him. There was no bitterness in her tone, no accusation, just truth, unadorned. "I should have listened to you," Adrian said. "Back then." Eleanor considered that. "You heard me," she replied. "You just didn't value what I was saying." The distinction mattered. Adrian nodded slowly, absorbing it. "I didn't realize what you were to me until you weren't there." "That's usually how it goes," Eleanor said gently.
He looked at her then, really looked, as if hoping to find a trace of the woman he had left behind. What he saw instead was someone unfamiliar, composed, present, whole in a way that didn't reach for him. "I'm sorry," he said. The words sounded sincere, late but sincere. Eleanor accepted them without ceremony. "I believe you," she said. "But belief isn't the same as reconciliation." Adrian swallowed. "Is there anything left?" She shook her head once, slowly. "There's understanding. There's closure. That's what's left." They finished their coffee in silence. When they stood to leave, Adrian hesitated, as if searching for permission that would never come. Eleanor extended her hand. He took it. The gesture was brief, civil, final. As she walked away, Eleanor felt no triumph, no regret. Just space, clear, open, hers. Some conversations don't heal by fixing the past. They heal by letting it go. After the conversation with Adrian, Eleanor didn't feel lighter right away. What she felt was quiet. The kind that arrives after a storm has passed, but the air hasn't settled yet. She walked home instead of taking a car, letting the city move around her without demanding anything. The river reflected the afternoon light, steady and unbothered, and for the first time in years, Eleanor noticed how her own pace matched it. Days followed, ordinary and unremarkable on the surface. Work continued, meetings, emails, strategy sessions that required focus but not self-erasure. Eleanor no longer felt the need to prove she belonged in those rooms. She belonged because she was there, because her insight held weight, because people listened without needing persuasion. What changed most was what happened after work. She stopped replaying conversations in her head, stopped bracing herself for disappointment. Evenings became something she looked forward to instead of endured. She cooked simple meals, sat by the window, read without rushing. The ache that once lived constantly in her chest loosened its grip, not dramatically, but definitively. Jonathan noticed the shift before she did. "You seem settled," he said one evening after a long session reviewing projections. There was no implication in his tone, just observation. Eleanor smiled slightly. "I think I am." They didn't define anything. They didn't rush into meaning. Their connection grew in the spaces between work, shared silence, mutual respect, conversations that didn't circle old wounds. Jonathan never asked her to explain her past. He understood that some chapters didn't need retelling to be honored. One morning, Eleanor woke up and realized she hadn't thought about Serena in weeks. Not with anger, not with curiosity, just not at all. The realization startled her more than any confrontation ever had. It meant the pain no longer needed an antagonist. It meant she had reclaimed the narrative fully. Grace noticed it too. The way Eleanor stood straighter, laughed more easily, no longer flinched when unexpected challenges appeared. Healing, Eleanor learned, wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who you were before you learned to disappear. There were still difficult days. Growth didn't erase complexity. But now, when doubt surfaced, Eleanor met it with patience instead of panic. She trusted her ability to respond, to adjust, to stand her ground without losing herself. One evening, standing in her apartment as the city lights came on, Eleanor caught her reflection in the glass. She didn't look triumphant. She looked at peace. The woman staring back wasn't defined by what she had survived or what she had lost. She was defined by what she had chosen again and again to protect her integrity, even when it cost her everything.
Eleanor placed her hand against the cool window and breathed deeply. For the first time since her marriage ended, her breath reached all the way down into her body, unblocked by fear or resentment. Her heart finally had room, and in that space, something gentle and steady took root, not hope for what might be, but trust in whatever came next. That, she realized, was the reward no one could take from her. The consequences didn't arrive with headlines. They came through calendars quietly clearing, through meetings canceled without explanation, through doors that no longer opened as easily as they once had. Adrian felt it most on Monday mornings when his inbox stayed eerily calm and the urgency that used to define his days evaporated. Power, he learned, was loud when it arrived. Its absence was silent. The board didn't remove him. That would have been too dramatic, too clean. Instead, they constrained him. New oversight, revised authority, decisions routed through committees that once rubber-stamped his instincts. Each adjustment was reasonable on its own. Together, they dismantled the image he had relied on. Investors didn't accuse. They reassessed. One by one, projects were paused, pending further review. Partnerships softened into conversations, then into polite distance. Adrian still worked harder than ever, but the momentum was gone. Every move required justification now. Every risk was questioned. Serena left without a scene. She framed it as timing, as misalignment, as a need to protect her own future. Adrian didn't argue. He understood finally that what she had loved was the version of him that commanded rooms effortlessly. That version no longer existed. Loneliness followed, not the sharp kind, but the hollow kind that echoed. Adrian watched the city from his office window one evening, the skyline unchanged, indifferent. For years he had believed success was proof of worth, that power justified choices, that replacing people was part of growth. Reality disagreed. Across town, Eleanor's name began appearing in rooms Adrian was no longer invited into. Not loudly, not boastfully, just enough to establish presence. Her work spoke for itself. Her recommendations carried weight. Decisions aligned around her clarity. No one framed it as revenge. They framed it as competence. That distinction mattered. Adrian saw it the day a potential partner mentioned Eleanor casually, referencing her insights with respect that bordered on admiration. Adrian nodded, offering neutral acknowledgement, but something inside him shifted irreversibly. He understood then that justice didn't need spectacle. It needed accuracy. Eleanor hadn't taken anything from him. She hadn't demanded apologies or satisfaction. She had simply stopped compensating for his blind spots. Without her balance, his excess had nowhere to hide. Months passed. Adrian adapted, but the cost was permanent. He was no longer the unquestioned authority, no longer the man whose confidence could override concern. He had to listen now. He had to slow down. He had to live with the knowledge that the person he dismissed had outgrown him in every metric that mattered. And Eleanor? She didn't look back.
Justice had already been served, not through humiliation, but through alignment. She stood exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who valued precision over performance, integrity over noise. In the end, the universe didn't punish Adrian. It corrected him. And correction, he discovered too late, was the most fitting consequence of all. Eleanor returned to Fifth Avenue months later on a morning washed in pale sunlight. The city felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked without destination, hands tucked into her coat pockets,
letting the rhythm of the street set her pace. Storefront windows reflected a woman who no longer measured herself against what she'd lost. She had gained something quieter, stronger. Her days were full now, not crowded. Work that challenged her without consuming her. Colleagues who respected her boundaries.
Evenings that belonged to her, not to anxiety or repair. She no longer woke with a knot in her chest or fell asleep replaying the past. She had room. Jonathan walked beside her, matching her stride without trying to lead. Their relationship had grown the way healthy things did, without urgency, without performance. He never asked her to be grateful, never framed himself as the ending to her story. He simply showed up, consistently, choosing her without conditions. They stopped at a corner cafe, one they'd visited many times before. The barista recognized them. That small familiarity made Eleanor smile. It felt earned. As they sat, Jonathan reached across the table and placed a small, unassuming box between them. No spectacle, no audience. Eleanor looked at it, then at him. "I don't need an answer today," Jonathan said. "Or ever, if you don't want to give one. I just want you to know that whatever you choose, I'm here because I want to be, not because you need me." Eleanor opened the box slowly. Inside was a ring. Simple, thoughtful, nothing that shouted ownership or victory. It wasn't a promise of rescue. It was an invitation to walk forward together. Tears welled, not from fear, not from pain, but from recognition. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who shrank to fit someone else's ambition, the one who signed papers just to stop hurting, the one who believed survival was the best she could hope for. She was gone now. Eleanor closed the box gently and placed her hand over Jonathan's. "Yes," she said, not because she needed safety, but because she had found it within herself first. Later that day, Eleanor walked alone again, passing familiar streets, familiar lights. At the same corner where she once passed Adrian without being seen, she paused, not to look back, but to notice how far she'd come. Adrian's world still existed somewhere in the city. Serena's too. They no longer occupied space in her mind. Their chapter had closed, not with bitterness, but with balance restored. Eleanor stepped forward as the light turned green. She didn't feel victorious. She felt complete. The woman who once disappeared had returned not to prove anything, not to punish anyone, but to live fully, visibly, and on her own terms. That was the ending she deserved. And this time, it was real. So the story comes to a close here. And if you're still with us at this moment, then something in this journey has touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe you didn't come for Eleanor's success or her glow-up. Maybe you stayed because somewhere along the way, you recognized a piece of yourself in her silence, her endurance, her slow rebuilding. The real lesson of this story isn't revenge. It's alignment. Eleanor didn't win because she proved anyone wrong. She won because she stopped abandoning herself. As the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Healing begins the moment we stop begging the past to change and start choosing how we respond to it. Life doesn't always reward us with instant justice or dramatic payback. More often, it offers something quieter and deeper: self-respect, clarity, and peace. When you no longer need validation from those who hurt you, you become free. And freedom, not applause,
is the truest form of success. If this story resonated with you, if it mirrored a chapter of your own life, take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who may need to hear this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more stories like this, stories of resilience, dignity, and healing, are coming. Thank you for being here, truly.